There are millions of acres of opportunity out there. They belong to you. Every day, decisions are being made that affect your land, your water, your wildlife. You should know about them. This is your mountain.
Welcome, everybody, to the Your Mountain podcast. I'm Nephi Cole, and today I am sitting in the seat that I normally sit in, but Dave Wilms is not with us today because he is both working, which is a giant surprise.
Yeah, right.
And Mike is sitting in the seat Dave usually sits in. So,
yeah. Well,
Mike McGrady, how you doing?
Dave's working and has the sniffles.
Yeah, and, you know, he usually has this. Like, he's always sick, isn't he?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like, literally, like, Dave is like, I mean...
He might be sick and tired.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Poor Dave.
Yeah, anyways.
So, yeah, it's kind of a different day. Yeah, today was interesting because both you and I are both wearing suits today. Suits and ties, which is kind of different.
Yeah, it's different. Yeah.
Yeah, so typically on a day like this, you know, the legislative sessions have started up, so I'm running all over the place and visiting with legislators, and you're just doing what you do every day.
That's right. Well, you know, usually at some point at the end of the day, I get to take this suit off, but not today.
Not today. Yeah, so today, actually, I was with the... at the Wyoming legislature today, and following a number of interesting things that are going on there, which is going to drive our topic for the day. Today, we're going to talk about how a bill becomes a law, but not just how a bill becomes a law. We're also going to talk about the difference between regulations and bills, how regulations become law, rules, guidance, and then how litigation makes a bill not become a law anymore.
Undoes a law.
Undoes a law.
Yeah. It's the reverses it all. Yeah.
Yeah. So how's your week, first of all?
So far, so good.
Anything exciting going on?
Oh, no, just busy. That's all.
Yeah.
That's all. Just, I don't want to bore anybody with any details.
I was in Washington, D.C., and I literally just got back last night late enough that I hadn't even unpacked my suitcase yet this morning. And every time I go to Washington, D.C., I'm so glad I don't live in Washington, D.C.
Oh, it's a great place to visit.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah.
Just crazy times there. And it was interesting because I sat in some meetings with both Mike Pompeo and with Nancy Pelosi. And let me tell you, that was, given the politics of the hour. Yeah, right. It was some great theater.
Yeah.
And I was sitting with two folks who represent the pharmaceutical industry. And that was, you know, they were really...
Your neighborhood drug dealers?
Oh, boy, they were not happy campers. They were... It doesn't matter who... Everybody dislikes them now, so it's pretty entertaining that way.
Yeah, no, I just... spent a lot of time last couple of weeks writing briefs and filing stuff. I had to file something in front of the Supreme Court, so that was a little different. Organizing a printer because they have special booklets. You know, the United States Supreme Court has these special booklets you have to have, and so you can't just print them on 8.5 by 11 sheets of paper.
Are you going to be trying a case up there?
Oh, we'll see. They would have to take. It's on a petition for cert, so there's a 1.2% chance.
Well, good luck. I actually hope you get it. So I think that'd be super cool if you got the opportunity to argue up there. Dave's argued up there, and he's always loves talking about that. And so
Dave had a case.
Yeah, it's a unique opportunity for you guys when you get those when you get that. So a bunch of state legislatures have just kicked off. So it's early in the year. Mike, what's the difference between state legislatures and you know, federal legislation? Like, if you had to just sum it up in a word.
State legislatures impact what's going on day to day inside a state.
Yeah.
Federal impacts all states.
Yeah. You know, how long does it take you to get a piece of federal legislation done?
Oh, depends on the issue.
Well, let's just pick an issue. I mean, pick a topic. Let's say invent a bill.
Okay.
Let's have you invent a bill really quickly and talk about making a bill.
I have invented a bill in my mind, and it's going to take, what, a decade?
About a decade to get through.
Yeah, it depends. It depends on what it is, but yeah, that's if you're going to work up a bill separately and just pick an issue, whatever it is, as a standalone bill, it could take a decade of investigation, committee action, a variety of things. Or it could be a single issue that gets tacked on to some other must-pass bill. So it could be quickly, too.
So it could be quickly if you have a bill, a sportsman's package, and then you have a bill that, let's film crews with 5 or less individuals go into a wilderness area and film without needing a giant, huge permit.
Mm-hmm.
Like, that's a real bill, right?
Mm-hmm.
That was a real one that, tried to tack on. I don't think it made it, but that was one we tried to a bunch of people tried to tack on to the sportsman's package. But, so the sportsman's package itself, that's a decade long in development.
Right.
But these little pieces, they get dropped on kind of ad hoc.
Right. Yeah, they could be riders on different bills. They could show up in a variety of different ways. It's very different at the state level, though.
Exactly.
Depending on whether you have a full-time legislature or a citizen legislator.
Yep, and and that's why I wanted to kind of briefly, so you think in about 1 minute we can cover how a bill becomes a law.
Sure.
At the federal level.
Sure.
Go for it.
A bill gets introduced either into the House or the Senate, depending on what it is.
So you got two separate houses within Congress, two separate bodies within Congress. A bill starts in one side, or it starts in the other. Sometimes they'll be companion bills, those where they'll be virtually the same bill starts in both areas.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I said depending on the subject, because if it's a revenue-raising bill, it needs to start in the House. Mm-hmm. But generally, there's a bill that's introduced, and then it is referred to the committee that has jurisdiction over the issue, there's a whole process to figure that out. It gets marked up by either a subcommittee or committee, and eventually, after it has been looked at by folks who are specialists in that area, goes out to the full body of the House or the Senate.
Let's tell everybody quickly what markup means. What does that mean? So why do you go to a committee, and what is the markup? What occurs in markup? Because I think a lot of people think that, a bill just shows up. And so, for example, there are bills coming before the legislature that when they show up and people are like, oh, you should support this bill right now, or you shouldn't. Vote on it or you don't. But that's not really how it works, is it?
Right. It isn't put in as an up or down. It usually is put in as a concept. There's pretty well-defined terms and things in there. However, there's a process that involves the committee looking at it, having folks testify on it, good or bad, and then offering up ideas for improving the bill and increasing its odds of passage.
Yep. And that's the amendment process,
correct.
Right?
Yeah.
So what's going on there then is when a bill shows up, even when it gets moved into committee, what you're really doing is taking this concept and you're giving it to the group of experts, legislators who are supposed to be, whether it's federal or state, they're in charge of a specific area like House Natural Resources.
Right. Yeah. And even if they're not an individual expert, usually they get sort of put into committees where they have some sort of background. But even if they're not, the staff tends to be, the people who come in and testify tends to be experts. And so the legislators are delegated with the task of making decisions on how to improve that bill, whether to approve it or disapprove it or whatever on their vote.
So this is where the sausage gets made.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, I think a great example of this is and we're going to talk about this next week, the Clean Water Act. So I know, talking with a friend, Lantani, about the Clean Water Act, he's, very passionate about what he, his reading of what it should be, because he knows some of the guys who were the staffers who originally worked on writing the original language of the Clean Water Act. So that original language original language, whatever the staff, whoever writes up that bill, right, that gets sponsored by a representative or a senator, or whoever, at the end of the day, a senator's like, this is my bill, but that's not actually the guy who writes the bill, right? He's influential in it, and he has to okay it. It has to be what he believes, but he's got a bunch of people underneath him developing that bill. Then they bring it to committee, and then what happens?
Then they mark it up.
And it gets changed.
It gets changed, and then once it gets out of committee, it can go to another committee if there's cross-jurisdiction. Or it could just go to the floor, and then there could be a vote by the full body. And then it could go over to the other house. And say if it started in the House of Representatives and go over to the Senate, unless there were companion bills that would then cross. Eventually, it runs through the same process in the other chamber. And then if there are differences, which oftentimes there will be a conference committee of some group of members from both body that will come together and iron out the differences, go back for the final vote among the bodies in the House and the Senate, and then it has gone through bicameral, and then it gets presented to the president for signature or veto.
So there's a lot. So at the end of the day, they're literally, when I say sausage making, there's a lot of people that are weighing in on a given bill.
It took more than a minute, Nephi.
Yeah.
But
I know.
So the one thing about the comment about the staffers writing the bills, that's absolutely right. Oftentimes, committee staff or members' staff will write the legislation that gets introduced. And so while you could have the intent of an author who is a staff member have a great idea associated with something, that's not the intent of Congress ultimately.
That's right.
So when it comes time to interpret what that law means, what the staffer thought doesn't necessarily matter. In fact, what an individual legislator thinks or even says on the floor doesn't really matter. It's what is in the language of the bill that matters.
Right. Actually, one of my favorite comments is it's not intent. It's content that counts.
Yeah, right.
It's not your intent. It's the content that counts.
Well, and the staff does oftentimes try to provide additional legislative history through committee reports and things that try to explain, well, this is what we were attempting to accomplish, but that, that's not always looked to as valid sources, especially if they're different from the actual plain language of the law.
Yeah, and that consensus building can be messy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, everybody, you may not get everything you wanted.
That's right.
So I like the sandwich analogy, and this is what making laws is, right? It's like if you come, like we're going to make a sandwich. If I'm going to make a sandwich that I like, my sandwich is going to be roast beef and, mayo and tomatoes and mustard. And
you lost me at mayo.
Yeah, your sandwich isn't going to have mayo on it. It's turkey and everything like that. But at the end of the day, if we both have to share the same sandwich, we ended up with peanut butter and jelly.
That's right.
Right? It didn't end up being either of us want it, but it's a sandwich.
Yeah,
And so we both get to eat a sandwich. It's just not exactly the sandwich that we wanted at the end of the day. And I think the lawmaking process, we talk sometimes on this podcast about being pragmatic. That's what's it's not sexy. That's what's uncool about it to people is that at the end of the day, you often don't get your entire wish list. You're going to get some of the things. Mm-hmm. And so that's it. That's making a law at the federal level.
Yep.
State level.
State level tends to have a very similar process. Not every state is set up the same. When you think about Nebraska and their unicameral, right? So they don't have a House and Senate. They just have one body.
See you next week, Nebraska.
Yeah. And then, but many other legislative bodies around the country have similar House, Senate, governor sort of process that they run through committees and bills. It tends to go a lot faster.
That's right.
There are some legislative bodies that are full-time state legislative bodies, but
there aren't that many though. Like California is a full-time.
Yeah.
Who else is full-time?
I don't think I could even tick them off because I only pay attention to one. So
yeah, and I don't have. And there's, I get around to a lot of states. None of the states that I visit are full-time.
Yeah. So the one I'm most familiar is the Wyoming legislature, and they have a citizen legislature, what is described as, in that there's a general session in odd years that lasts like 40, 45 days, and then there's a budget session that lasts about 20 days, and there's restrictions on what you can introduce during budget sessions. But that, I think, is unique for Wyoming in that we budget and going out 2 years on a balanced budget. Other legislatures do it differently, and there are longer periods of time or shorter periods of time. So there's it could be a variety of mix, but it really is the same kind of thing where we have a republic where you have your representatives, your senators that are portioned by whatever your state constitution is and says needs to be done in order to put in representatives that are caring for the objectives of your local community.
So I think the reason I wanted to bring up state versus federal is because a lot of people, we concentrate on these federal regulations. Mm-hmm. But the state process moves extremely fast.
It does. Yeah.
So where a federal bill, 10 years, right?
Can be. Yeah.
Yeah. How long does it take to pass a bill in a state?
Sometimes 20 days.
Yeah. I was going to say sometimes 10 days.
Yeah. Right.
Like it can be that fast. It's depending on when it gets introduced. If they want to, how fast they want to move through the process.
Yeah.
It can go through committee hearings in one side, a full vote, and then pop over to the next committee within days.
Now, it can have a pure introduction and passage in that quick of a time, but normally for the things that are bigger issues, there's interim committee meetings and there's other things going on where information is developed, and then an ultimate package that is pretty much agreed upon, introduced at the time when the legislature opens.
Now, I'm going to agree with you and disagree with you. So I agree with maybe judicial committee in Wyoming will hear very big things, or there's a lot in appropriations in a different state where they're dealing with money. They'll have extra meetings, but you also get these bills that come in every state. This happens where each legislator will get to carry specific bills, and so you'll have, for example, a bill on a bill that fundamentally changes licensing for hunting. Any legislator can bring that in front of a committee, and it could be 40 days of a legislative session, and that bill could be law.
Sure.
And it can fly through.
And they those bills are all introduced, referred to committee of jurisdiction. There are committee hearings, but it's going very fast at the state level. So you really have to be paying attention and present during those times when the bills are being heard, so that you can get your information to the members of the legislature. It's not one of those you just wait around and see what happens.
Yep.
It's moving fast.
So those are bills becoming laws, but sometimes, and this is the next part that I wanted to visit, that we want to talk about. What's the difference between, so how does rule and regulation play into that?
So normally you have a law that's passed that encompasses a broad subject matter, and that law that's passed by the legislature and signed by the governor usually has some component that says we are going to delegate the authority in this law to an agency of some sort, and that agency will develop regulations or rules designed around putting the meat on the bones.
Yep.
Better explaining what the law, how it'll handle, how it'll be carried out on a day-to-day activity by the agency, because many times the legislature can't get into those details, and they're not necessarily the day-to-day experts on those matters. And so there could be an act related to the regulation of hunting of a species, and the expectation is that the game management agency will then come in and define what it means related to the hunting. It can be what calibers could be used. It could be what the seasons might be. It could be a variety of things like that we normally see. But those are usually implementing regulations or
so
rules.
Usually those things aren't set through the legislative process.
Correct.
So usually, like if you're setting up 30 caliber is okay to shoot elk with, like that's not something typically that the whole legislature is going to vote on.
No, generally not. Yeah. So there, it's more of those details to fill out how to carry out the objectives that are set out in legislative intent. And then that's a whole separate process that goes into developing those rules and regulations.
So how long does it take to develop a rule or regulation? Let's start at the federal level.
At the federal level, usually about a year minimum.
Okay.
And then a little faster at the state level.
Yep. And I want people to understand that, because when we talk about laws, and said how long does it take to make a law? It can be a decade to make a law. But then when that law is done, there's a new process that starts where Congress hands the ball off to the executive branch and says, go implement the law that we passed. And then the executive branch starts the rulemaking process.
That's right. And they follow a similar track, whether you're at the state or federal. Just really kind of depends on the intricacies according to what the rules of the road are for developing those rules and regulations.
Yep. So there's a legal process that they have to follow in developing the regulation.
Yeah. Both of them, both at state and federal, the expectation should be that there is a law that's been passed, a statutory law that defines the administrative procedure, usually called the Administrative Procedure Act.
Yep, APA.
Right.
If you hear people talking about APA, that's what they're talking about.
And that generally is going to have two components to it. One is rulemaking, and how to develop the rules that implement the statutes, and the other is more of a adjudicative fashion, in that you could have something where a decision has to be made whether you're impacting a license or like an outfitter's license. If you wanted to approve or disapprove a license, there's a process to adjudicate those issues. So you can have a legislative-based and adjudicatory-based components within the Administrative Procedure Act and some other little intricate things. But it's generally, as we've discussed on this podcast before, a notice and comment type process to set up rules and regulations where the expectation is the agency's not going to do this in the dark. They're going to let the public know what the proposal is, how they interpret the legislation that has come down, whatever they have to implement, and basically set out the ways in which they will identify how they're going to carry out those functions on a day-to-day basis. And then there's a prescribed time period by which folks get to look at that and then submit comments. Sometimes there are public hearings around those particular proposed regulations, and then typically that draft gets formulated based upon comment into a final version. Sometimes there's comment around that, and then once the regulations have run through all of the traps for the Administrative Procedure Act process, it becomes like law.
Like law.
Mm-hmm.
Why do you say like law?
Well, they're not statutes, right?
Yeah.
They're regulations, and they can have the force and effect of law if they follow the proper procedure. But there are a number of things that agencies do that try to describe how they're going to carry out a program that do not have the force and effect of law.
What's that?
Guidance.
Guidance.
Mm-hmm.
Explain guidance real quick.
Okay, so guidance is similar in that you have an agency that has a statute, some sort of statutory objective or directive to do something. They can create regulations that try to put some more meat on the bones, and then sometimes they need additional information for things that don't rise to the level of legal requirements, but basically say, okay, when we talk about X, Y, or Z, we intend to do this particular type of activity.
It's just broadly,
so,
like this is what we're going to do broadly. Broadly, how we're going to do it. But when we get, but if it's too specific, and this is something, if it's too specific, so broadly the agency is like, well, this is the guidance we use to determine how we do that.
Mm-hmm.
If it's once it becomes more important, you have to go to rulemaking.
Well, certainly if the guidance in some way has an effect on a right of a person, or whether it's a property right or some other right, or has a legal impact on them.
Yeah, so it
has to run through rulemaking,
because then it can cause you to be in non-compliance with the law or an existing rule or regulation.
Sure. If there was something that they put into guidance that suddenly resulted in the ability for you to get fined if you didn't follow it, or something like that, then that's a problem if it doesn't run through the notice and comment process expected under the Administrative Procedure Act. So guidance tends to be those kinds of things where they say, well, generally we're going to do the regulations a certain way, and not have that full sort of effect in there. And there is a significant difference. And sometimes there are regulations that aren't treated the same as others, but guidance is essentially a step down from that. And it is informative. People can look at it to understand what they can expect.
Yeah, and it helps define what an agency professional out on the field doing work. Mm-hmm. Say you're working for the BLM, you have guidance on different stuff, how you're supposed to work with, grazing or whatever. Mm-hmm. Like there will be guidance out there that helps define how you do your paperwork, how you go through people's permitting,
if there was a regulation that required certain type of monitoring, the guidance would be more of an explanation on how to carry out that monitoring.
How to do the monitoring.
Yeah, how to do the monitoring. But not necessarily what the result would be or the consequences of the monitoring.
So now I'm going to shift gears a little bit. So we've talked about like laws that start one way and then they become consensus based, and then they get handed from the legislative branch down to the executive for implementation. And sometimes they need to then develop further rules and regulations regarding that law. Do agencies ever misinterpret the stuff? Do they ever misinterpret when I'm an agency head and Congress has developed some rules and regs? Do agencies ever do that wrong?
Yes.
Are you sure?
Yes.
How?
I've seen it.
Yeah, no, what I'm just saying.
Yeah.
Give us an
So,
example
well,
of like, and there are some examples playing out in the courts right now. I don't know what we need to talk about, but where these laws come down and then there's agency regulations that are now in dispute.
Mm-hmm. Well, so it can happen a couple of different ways. It can be brought to the attention of folks in a couple of different ways. Certainly, if an agency interprets a statute and they do it wrong, Congress has the ability to go in under the Regulatory Review Act, right? And basically yank the rug out from whatever the regulation
And that
is.
happened multiple times at the turnover of the last administration.
From the Obama to the Trump administration. And that act has been on the books for a long time, but it's rarely used. It comes up, and there's some certain time frames that are not relevant. But so that's one thing. Or Congress could simply see what's going on and decide to make a tweak to the law in the actual statutes to force the agency to go back to the drawing board with their regulations. Another way that it can happen is an agency could take an interpretation of the
stop you real quick.
Oh, okay.
I know. But the reason I'm going to stop you is because you said like it doesn't happen very often. But for everybody to understand, there's a whole lot of controversial stuff that happened in the turnover between the Obama and the Trump administrations, where people are like, where Trump, there was discussion about things that got rolled back, things that got undone. And what happened, correct me if I'm wrong, a whole bunch of agencies at midnight on just November, December is pretty late to be kicking out rules and regulations when you're going to have a turnover. They implemented new rules and regs.
Sure. Well,
and then the new administration came back and said, wait a minute.
Yes. Now it's not unusual. It's not an unusual situation for an agency to be wrapping up its regulations at the end of their term, right? A president comes in, they fill out their cabinet, they get everybody in place, they get their policies and objectives set in, they start to do the regulations, and it's a time suck on the agency to get that done. And it can take 4 years to get a federal regulation through, and so it may not be to the end of a presidential term to sign something and to have force effect the law, right? And once it's in place under the APA, you have to undo that using the APA through the notice and comment process to change it, right?
Yep. So you have to go back through and do the exact same stuff. You got to follow the Administrative Procedures Act.
So it's not unusual to see the signing of regulations at the end of any administration, any 4-year term of a president, or 8-year term. And usually the bigger packages are at the end of the 8-year term. And so there have been several instances in which the turnover has caused the new administration coming in to reevaluate things, especially when you have a change in political party, right? But we saw some significant ones, and we saw a significant shift in the attitude of the public and the administration coming in between the Obama administration and the Trump administration. And so the Congressional Review Act was implemented actually it had been done before, but it was pretty rare. And so it came into being, and it was used in a couple of contexts, and it wasn't used in some others. The voting process still had to go through and get approval from a significant number of the members. I can't remember if it's a simple majority, but it's a process.
Okay, so I distracted you.
No, it's fine.
Now go back to the second way now.
So the second way was legislation's passed. Agency comes out and says, "Okay, here's our interpretation. Here's our guidance. Here's how we're going to implement this," and then Congress can hold hearings and things and review what's going on because they get reports oftentimes. They have report requirements embedded into legislation, and that Congress can get it and say, yeah, that's not what I thought you were going to do, or that's not what we intended. And so they can redo the legislation or give additional direction to the agencies, causing them to go and redo the regulations through the Administrative Procedure Act process. Another way that you're kind of getting to is we can have court challenges of the regulations, and that's been I don't know if it's more common these days, but it's certainly something that has brought more focus and attention as we advance in increased information and knowledge, right?
So we talked about how a bill becomes a law, and then implementation of that law requiring rules, regulations, sometimes guidance. Tell me now, let's talk about this. How does litigation make a law unbecome a law? How does it undo the entire process we just talked about? How does litigation undo those processes?
Well, there are a couple of different ways, but essentially there's court action is filed. Typically, it's going to be federal court, federal regulation. That's kind of what we've been talking about. Administrative Procedure Act provides a process that folks can go in and challenge an action. They still have to have standing to bring an action.
So explain that really quick. So tell people, give an example how an Administrative Procedures Act violation would then open up an opportunity for suit or challenge of the rule. What would I say if I were to say, hey, you did me wrong under the APA?
Yeah, right. So, and granted, let's just go back. Standing. You have to have standing to sue. That's true in all federal courts.
Explain standing?
Yeah, so essentially under Article 3 of the United States Constitution, federal courts are of limited jurisdiction, and there has to be subject matter jurisdiction, so the court has to be able to talk about the issue. Personal jurisdiction over the individual in some way, depending on how it comes up, and it can just be from a statute. But really in the administrative context, the expectation is the individual who's going to sue at the end of the day has already participated heavily in the process and has some sort of stake in the game.
Yep.
Right? You can't just sit on your rights, come in at the end and go, yeah, I didn't like what you did. I know I didn't tell you what I didn't like ahead of time.
Yeah, so I can't, there's a new regulation that governs steel workers in Pennsylvania. I probably don't have standing to make a lawsuit there.
Certainly, if you have not even written into the agency to comment about the regulation.
If I just stood on the sidelines, I'm like, I think I'd like to sue the federal government on something that I didn't care about before.
Right. The courts have set up a system that the expectation is that you will be active in notifying notifying the agency your concerns, so that they are the ones with the first opportunity to make corrections and fix things. The court is not in a position and is not well suited to fine-tune the regulations. And that kind of gets to the end result of litigation. But before we get there, let's just talk real quickly on there. A number of ways in which cases tend to be filed over either regulations or projects or things. But generally the APA is the first kind of component, and it is the type of claim, if you have standing, that you were supposed to follow a certain process, and you didn't do that.
So the APA, Administrative Procedures Act, let's use an example. Let's say I don't like something the EPA did or is considering doing regarding air quality.
So if they were to propose a regulation relative to air quality.
It says air can't smell like diesel.
Sure. Yeah. Or
diesel pickups can't puke big black belchy.
So if there was a tailpipe regulation or whatever regulation in which the agency did a draft and proposed something, right?
A rule,
and they said, okay, you can only have so many particulates coming out of...
So much puke.
Yeah, coming out of the end of the tailpipe. It goes through the notice and comment process from the draft to the final. Suddenly they're saying, oh, and this also impacts the puke coming out of home stoves.
That wouldn't apply. That's not fair.
Right.
Right? Because they didn't tell me up front.
Correct.
So I got a home stove and I'm like, wait a minute.
So I
didn't even know that was coming.
Yeah. So you would bring a litigation. You'd say, look, you did not provide fair notice and opportunity to comment on the issues that were ultimately resolved or developed in the regulation. And what you did is not even a logical outgrowth. I could have no way of knowing that you suddenly were going to regulate me in that way, me as in the home stove owner, right? And so, that could be an APA procedural challenge. And then there could also be some things where you say, look, you normally we were dealing in environmental regulations. You could say, look, you proposed something and it was so unrelated to what the science is saying you're supposed to do that you're just so far out of the realm of possibility here or reason that you got it wrong. So
you and I let's just pretend we drive diesel pickups and we both puking the big black clouds of diesel.
Rolling coal.
Coal. We both like rolling coal. And the rolling coal rule, which we've been following and we've been weighing in and saying, we don't think that's fair. We think we should be able to roll coal. Every other stoplight should be okay.
Yeah.
And then suddenly the rule comes out and EPA says, Not only can you not roll coal, you can't have dumb stickers on the back of your truck either.
Right. Yeah.
You'd be like, wait a minute.
Yeah.
How is that an outgrowth of?
Sure.
But I mean, that's just a silly.
Yeah. But I think what you're
works.
trying to get at too is that the idea that the stuff that's coming out of the tailpipe, maybe it's regulated down to 0.5 particulates, per million or whatever it is, parts per billion or something like that. And the science demonstrates that, in fact, it should be 0.2 to have some sort of measurable impact, or maybe it's
And we're making all this up on the fly. So everybody who cares about this issue, this is a total fictitious.
Perfectly safe to have twice as much or whatever. Yeah. And by having it as restrictive it is, there would be significant and irreparable economic impacts that weren't even considered by the agency. Yeah. So there are a variety of things that folks can bring to the attention of the court.
Anymore.
Right. Now, the great thing about if you're an agency, the great thing is that the court rule systems have set up to really defer to the federal agencies and in state systems, state agencies, as the experts for interpreting the legislation that they have been delegated to interpret. Mm-hmm. Right? They're the subject matter experts. They're the ones that are supposed to know what's happening. And so the agent or the court system basically says the agency, you're the experts, we're not, and we need to see something very clear and obvious or an obvious procedural defect before we will do anything, which gets to the result of the litigation normally in these instances is that the court will look at options for what to do. Do they enjoin the rule and basically in equity say, okay, we can't do X, Y, or Z? Will they vacate the rule, vacatur?
So let's go back to our truck comment.
Mm-hmm.
So the truck comment, what we've got going on then with our truck, if they they're going to put a stay on the rule. So they're going to tell EPA, you can't tell Nephi that he can't have stickers on the back of his truck.
Mm-hmm.
Because I'm saying that's not fair. And so that's a stay.
A stay would be staying the enforcement. Like you can't enforce this until you go do something different or until a period of time where folks can kind of catch up with going into things. But they could also go in and carve out and say, the tailpipe regulation, that's fine. Sticker stuff, we're going to just vacate that portion of the regulation.
Mm-hmm.
And so you need to go back to the drawing board and rewrite it to get it off the books. But essentially by judicial opinion, it's not. Yeah, it's not good law.
The court says, you overstepped.
Mm-hmm.
It's like you didn't have that authority in the first place.
Right, yeah, absolutely. So there's a variety of ways in which the court can make decisions about what to do as a consequence of the finding against the agency, whether it is completely sending it back to the drawing board and not letting something go into effect, or a hybrid approach, or only kind of covering a few things and not others. So, which is another way to say a hybrid approach. Now, there's a whole legal process in there because we're just describing generally the district court, although with the EPA stuff, you would go right to the circuit courts, whether the intermediate between federal district court and the United States Supreme Court, potentially even the D.C. Circuit, depending on what the act says. Because some acts say you go to X court.
Yeah, you go straight to D.C.
You go straight to this location, and some are just general, and it can be according to the choice of the plaintiff.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure no one listening to this podcast thinks this is as fascinating as I do, and you do. I mean, because this is like a world that we live in. But here's the spoiler. Next week, we're going to talk about the new Waters of the U.S. rule. The new rule that came out from that was put out by the Trump administration defining the waters of the U.S. Believe it or not, everything that we just talked about, Mike and I just talked about, applies to the old rule and the new rule. And it is the reason that we are where we are today. As all these things come into play. Because really, this entire argument starts out as intent. And what some people, intent of different individuals who, on different sides of what they think is reasonable, who then made a law. Right?
Right. A law that had the words waters of the United States
waters of the U.S., and then they punted to some agencies.
But they didn't define what that meant.
That's right. They punted to some agencies to define the scope through rule and regulation. And then the agencies went through multiple efforts to try and get that right. And there was guidance that came out and rules that came out.
And litigation.
And litigation that specifically targeted the agency for failures to follow the Administrative Procedures Act, and with the claim that the agencies went beyond the scope of what the original law allowed them to regulate. Mm-hmm. That's what we're going to talk about next week in some depth, and hopefully having this primer will help folks understand that a little bit.
That's all assuming Dave's sniffles are, cured.
Or if he dies, we'll just do it ourselves.
Okay.
Is that too far?
No, we're good. We're good.
All right, Dave.
Yeah.
Hey, thank you all for listening to the Your Mountain podcast today. That we are going to keep this episode short because both Mike and I have to run back to other meetings. But we hope that you're following us on Facebook, on where do we post stuff? Because I don't even know. Where does Dave take care of social media?
Well,
Instagram, Twitter,
and Facebook at It's Your Mountain.
Mm-hmm. And then
comments can go into Your Mountain at itsyourmountain.com.
Yep. And please check us out on iTunes and subscribe, because that actually really helps us out in terms of being able to bumps our episodes up so they're easier for other people to find. Mm-hmm. If you guys subscribe and give it a good rating, it'll help other people locate this type of information, and that's why we do it. And with that, remember everybody, life's about experiences.
So go have one.